In 1935, one of the most famous ocean liners of all time met a very sad fate. The Cunard steamer RMS Mauretania, which was the fastest ship on the North Atlantic for an incredible 20 years between 1909 and 1929, and much beloved by millions of passengers and seemingly the whole nation of Great Britain, was withdrawn from service and sold for scrap. She was principally a victim of the Great Depression. This famous photo depicts Mauretania and another grand old four-stack liner, the Olympic, about to go to the scrapyard in Scotland. Though there would never again be another ship quite like the Mauretania, there was another ship with that name that had a fascinating and illustrious career on her own. She was forever overshadowed by her more famous namesake, but the second Mauretania, launched in 1938, is definitely worthy of remembering. This video is the story of that second ship, which was still sailing well into the 1960s. Mauretania II, as she's sometimes called, has her own story to tell. Hello, Sean here. I'm a historian, author, podcaster, and teacher. Hopefully you've seen some of my other videos, and if not, why not? Come on, get with the program. You could also visit my website, seanmunger.com, where I teach history courses online, and I have a couple of podcasts, Green Screen and Second Decade. But enough about me. When you get interested in ocean liners, as I did when I was a kid, there's sort of a cycle of discovery that you go through. The Titanic is usually the gateway drug to ocean liner fever, and then you learn that the Titanic had a sister ship, Olympic. You just saw a picture of her. And you also learn that the White Star Line, one of Britain's two biggest passenger ship companies, had an ongoing rivalry with the Cunard Line. Then you learn about the Speed Twins, Lusitania, famously lost as a casualty of war in 1915, and Mauretania, the longtime holder of the speed record, until dethroned by Bremen in 1929. I did a video on Bremen recently, by the way. But when you get deeper into ocean liner lore, eventually you discover gems like the second Mauretania. Not as famous, not as glamorous, and didn't have a disastrous end, but if you come to love ocean liners, you can't help but love a ship like this one. As it turns out, the story of the second Mauretania is inextricably bound up with the story of her contemporaries, Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, the British superliners that replaced the earlier generation of ships of which Olympic and Titanic were a part. So let's try to unravel all the threads here and delve into the origin story of this beautiful and fascinating ship, the Mauretania II. The life story of the second Mauretania begins here. This is the Camel Laird shipyards in Birkenhead, England, on the River Mersey in Liverpool, a very famous shipyard that's been building ships here since 1828. Among their many famous creations include the CSS Alabama, the raider built for pro-slavery Confederate forces in the U.S. Civil War, and later the World War II era British warships Ark Royal and Prince of Wales. This firm is still in business, as you can see. Mauretania's keel was laid here on May 24, 1937. That was less than 6 months after the start of construction on the Queen Elizabeth, which was built in Scotland. This matters because the two ships were developed together. Mauretania was sort of the junior varsity Queen Elizabeth, or an understudy, so to speak. Here was Cunard White Star's global strategy in a nutshell. The newly merged shipping line was chasing the Holy Grail, a reliable weekly transatlantic passenger service that would offer departures from both the UK and New York, week in and week out, with 2 ships. Given how fast ocean liners were getting in the late 30s, this was almost possible, but your 2 ships had to be lightning fast in order to do it. This was why Queen Mary, which debuted in 1936, and Queen Elizabeth, which was building, were created. But the company also thought it prudent to have a smaller ship in reserve, an understudy who could step in and make voyages when one or the other of the queens was undergoing repairs or otherwise unable to sail. Again, I'll use the analogy of the understudy. Mauretania was the understudy. But she also had another role. She would voyage in tandem with and mesh with the schedules of the motor liners Britannic and Georgic, the last ships built for the White Star Line before the merger. With 3 ships, you didn't need to be the fastest to do a weekly service rotation. This was similar to how the Germans were offering weekly sailings with their trio, the big dogs Bremen and Europa, and their understudy, Columbus. The new Mauretania was considerably smaller than either of the big ladies she was destined to work with, the main stars of the show. Mauretania was 35,700 tons, 772 feet long, 89 feet wide, and was designed to have a top speed of 23 knots. She wasn't made to win any speed records, but still fast enough to provide that weekly service with the 2 other ships. Cunard White Star was banking on the popularity of the name Mauretania, but at the same time they also didn't want her to be overshadowed by her famous namesake. So in terms of outfitting and accommodations, she was given a look totally unlike her Edwardian-era predecessor. Here are some views of her interior. Art Deco was still a thing in 1938, and you can definitely see a heavy deco presence here, though perhaps not as heavy as some of the other liners of the earlier 1930s. In terms of tone and decor, Mauretania perfectly encapsulated the time when she debuted. I mean, look at this room, one of the many smoking lounges. Does this just not scream 1939? I mean, if you went back in time from today to sail on a transatlantic liner in 1939, you'd be pissed if it didn't look like this. I love ship interiors more than any other aspect of the great liners, so now you're getting a sense of why Mauretania II has a special place in my heart. Mauretania departed on her maiden voyage from Liverpool on June 17, 1939. That date alone should tell you something about what happened in short order. It was only 76 days before Adolf Hitler's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, beginning the European phase of World War II. She had time to make only 4 or 5 voyages across the Atlantic before the war broke out. She was in Liverpool at the time the war began, and was pretty much immediately commandeered into military service. The beautiful ship was painted gray and armed with guns. After a short time, the British government realized that Liverpool was an inviting target for Luftwaffe bombers, so in December 1939, Mauretania sailed with a skeleton crew to New York. She was still there in 1940 when her larger semi-sister ship, Queen Elizabeth, which had not yet made a passenger voyage, dashed out of the British waters across the Atlantic, and for a very brief time, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, Normandy, and Mauretania were all docked at adjoining piers in New York while the British government decided exactly how best to make use of their very fast and expensive ships. Mauretania left New York in March 1940. She sailed south and west through the Panama Canal, stopped in San Francisco to drop off her civilian fittings, and then wound up in Sydney, Australia for full conversion to a troop ship. This is a part of her life story that she has in common with most of the other great liners who survived World War II. During the war, Mauretania hauled troops one way and often German or Italian prisoners of war the opposite way. She delivered Australian soldiers to North Africa and the theaters of war in South Asia, and in advance of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France in 1944, she carried tens of thousands of American and Canadian troops to England, many of whom would hit the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day. All in all, Mauretania steamed 538,000 miles during World War II, carrying 340,000 troops. The service of the great liners wasn't done when peace came in 1945. For one thing, all those troops had to be got back home again, and there were tens of thousands of civilians that had been sent to various distant corners of the British Empire during the war who also wanted to go home again. So Mauretania was as busy in the year or so following the war as she had been during it. Perhaps somewhat exhausted, she wound up back in her home port, Liverpool, on September 2, 1946, exactly 1 year after the official end of World War II in the Pacific. It wasn't until 1947 that regular peacetime Atlantic crossings could begin in earnest. Now, after an 8-year delay, Cunard White Star, mostly now just called Cunard, finally had their ducks in a row. The 2 queens ready to go, Mauretania as the understudy. Mauretania weighed anchor in April 1947 from Liverpool bound for New York. She would sail from Southampton most of the time thereafter. Britannic and Georgic weren't in the game anymore, so her primary mission was as Queen Elizabeth's understudy. Although the North Atlantic passenger trade boomed in the late 1940s, the economics of the business, and of Britain still shattered by the war, were very different. Most ships, except the very biggest ones, couldn't earn their keep by transatlantic crossings alone. Cruising now became a major part of these ships' lives, Mauretania too. Most of these cruises served middle-class Americans, who after the war were really the only one of the major combatants who had any money when peacetime came. Mauretania cruised from New York to the Caribbean and the West Indies. Cunard tended to paint their ships black when they were on North Atlantic crossings and white when cruising. Later that color was changed to green. But keep in mind, Mauretania was built as a transatlantic liner, not a cruise ship. There is a difference. And as the 1950s wore on, Americans got richer and tourism-based travel became much more common than it had been before 1939. Even earning cruising dollars started to get tougher for ships like Mauretania. In another sign of changing times, Mauretania was outfitted with air conditioning in 1957. Can you imagine going on a Caribbean cruise without air conditioning? Not many could, beginning in the late 50s. But by now, Mauretania was beginning to face competition from other ships, the first generation of liners built after World War II, which were built with transatlantic and cruising double duty in mind from the get-go. And of course, there eventually came the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaur liners. Jet airplanes, particularly but not exclusively the Boeing 707, which made its first commercial flight in 1958, the year after Mauretania first switched on the AC. Almost immediately, passenger traffic on the liners began to slump. Mauretania was very susceptible to economic changes. She was one of the very first Cunard ships to become a net loss in terms of balance sheet. It was something that would happen to all of them eventually. Cunard tried various stunts to attract business, more cruises, different cruises. In 1963, Mauretania found herself serving various Mediterranean ports, but newer Italian ships were dominating that market. An aging British Greyhound built for the transatlantic trade was starting to look out of place in the jet-setting 1960s. The Mediterranean ploy didn't really work. In 1965, Cunard, facing ruinous losses, decided to pull the plug. The Queens would eventually be retired too, but Mauretania was the first to the gallows. She made one final trip from New York bound for another Mediterranean cruise, departing September 15, 1965. Passengers who took Mauretania were guaranteed return passage, first class, on any other Cunard liner, including Queen Mary or Queen Elizabeth. Not a bad bargain. During her 61-day cruise, the deal was made to sell Mauretania to the shipbreakers Thomas W. Ward in Inverkeithing, Scotland, the same yard that broke up Olympic, Titanic's sister ship. On November 20th, 1965, Mauretania left Southampton for that final lonely voyage to the scrapyard in Scotland. She had not yet lasted 30 years. By the end of 1966, there was nothing left of the ship but a few mementos. Some of her furnishings, incredibly, ended up in a department store tea room in a mall in St. Louis, Missouri, built in 1969. But those furnishings disappeared after the mall was torn down in 2001. Sadly, this great ship, one of the last of the big liners, was gone. So there you have it. Mauretania II wasn't as famous or as glamorous as her bigger and faster namesake. But this is still a ship worthy of remembering in her own right. If you're new to the subject of transatlantic liners, let this one be an example of the very familiar pattern that these ships' stories often take. A glorious idea, beautiful heyday interrupted by war, then a long, slow decline, and a final chapter in some grimy shipyard. But all of these ships had their own stories and their own personalities. I've got some other videos on nautical history topics. Check out my recent one on the history of the USS California, one of the lesser-known casualties of Pearl Harbor. And you can check out some more cool history stuff on my website, seanmunger.com. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you look me up again for another little bit of nautical history.